You created code to connect to a database using the SqlClient namespace in the previous lesson. That's lesson 10.5. In this lesson, you will continue to use the SqlClient namespace to execute a SQL query and retrieve the results. To begin, open the Market Trader project from your Sample Files folder. And open dataaccess.cs if it isn't open already. Now add the following code to the getMarketQuotes method inside the second using statement. Command.commandText equals select quote date, quote value from quote where market ID equals plus market ID plus order by quote date. This code provides an SQL query for the SQL command object. This query will retrieve the quote date and quote value fields from the quote table for records with the specified market ID. The results will be sorted by quote date. Note that the SQL query will not be sent to the database until you call one of the execute methods of the SQL command object. The SQL query will not be sent to the database until you call one of the execute methods of the SQL command object. Add the following code on the next line. SQL data reader equals command.execute reader. This code sends the SQL query to the database and places the results in a new SQL data reader object. The SQL command class has a number of methods that can be used to execute different types of SQL query. Execute reader is the method that you've used in your code. It's used for queries that return multiple results. Execute non-reader is used for queries that do not return any results, such as update commands. Instead, this method returns the number of records that were affected by the query. And finally, execute scalar is used for queries that only return a single result. This method will discard any results after the first. Now you're going to add some code to extract the results from the SQL data reader object and place them into a list collection. First, add the following code at the very beginning of the method. List quote quotes to return equals new list quote. You place this code on the first line of the event handler so that it will be available outside the using statements. Next, add the following while loop on the next line inside the second using statement. While reader.read. This while loop iterates through all of the database records that are contained in the SQL data reader object. The read method tells the SQL data reader object to move to the next record. It returns false if there are no more records left. Now add the following code inside the while loop. Quote new quote equals new quote dot quote date equals datetime reader quote date new quote dot quote value equals decimal reader quote value quote to return dot add new quote. This code creates a new quote object, populates it with the values from the SQL data reader object, and adds it to the quotes to return collection. Note that the quote class that you're using in this code is part of the project's link data classes. If you didn't have a link data context, you could create your own custom class to store quote records. You are only using the class that was automatically generated by link for the sake of convenience. Now add the following code after the end of the second using statement, but inside the first using statement. Connection.close. This code closes the connection to the database. Now at the very end of the method, add the code return quotes to return. This code returns the list of quotes, completing your method. Test your code now by viewing marketdata.aspx in your web browser. When the page loads, click Get Data. The database records are successfully retrieved by your code and displayed on the page. As you have seen, the SqlClient classes require a huge amount of code compared to link. My advice is to always use link, but you may need this understanding to support legacy code that was written using older versions of ASP.NET. It's important to be aware that sending SQL code directly to a database, as you've done in this lesson, can make your application vulnerable to SQL injection attacks. You will learn more about SQL injection attacks in Lesson 10.11. It is possible to use the SqlClient classes in a secure way by using the parameters property of the SQL command object. But again, it's better to use link instead. Close your web browser now, and close Visual Studio. You've now completed Lesson 10.6. Run a SQL query using the SqlClient namespace.